Thala, Tunisia. The 17th of February, 1943. A column of German Mark III tanks grinds forward through the dust thrown up by Rommel's last great counterpunch in North Africa. The road ahead choked with retreating lorries and shattered American armor. Somewhere in a slit trench beside that road crouches a British or Commonwealth soldier, and in his hand he holds something that should not, by any sane engineering standard, exist. It is a glass ball the size of a grapefruit, wrapped in stockinette, coated in a black, treacle-thick adhesive normally used to trap songbirds in tree branches. Inside that fragile sphere sits over half a kilogram of liquid nitroglycerin. He has perhaps 5 seconds, once he commits, to get clear of the explosion. He has to get close enough to touch the tank. He has to break the glass against the hull without breaking it against his own leg first. This is the sticky bomb, officially the grenade, hand, anti-tank number 74, and on this stretch of Tunisian road, it is about to help account for some of the half-dozen German tanks credited to it during the Allied stand at Thala. Pause on that image for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about how desperate Britain had become by the summer of 1940, and how strange the solutions to that desperation could be. A nation that had built the dreadnought, that would go on to build the jet engine and crack Enigma, had also, in its hour of greatest peril, issued its soldiers a weapon built around bird glue. And the genuinely uncomfortable truth, the one that makes this story worth telling, is that it worked. Not always, not reliably, not without maiming a number of the men who carried it. But it worked often enough, in tank holes scarred across 3 continents, that it remained in frontline service for the better part of the war. This is the story of how Britain's most absurd weapon of the Second World War came to be trusted by commandos, the Home Guard, and the French resistance alike, and why a device that frequently glued itself to the wrong target became, against every reasonable expectation, one of the small tools that helped hold the line when almost nothing else could. To understand why anyone would build something this hazardous, you have to go back to the beaches of Dunkirk in late May and early June of 1940. Over 9 days, the Royal Navy and a flotilla of civilian boats lifted more than 338,000 British and French soldiers off the sand and brought them home. It remains one of the great evacuations in military history. It was also, materially speaking, a catastrophe. The British Expeditionary Force left behind almost everything it had brought to France. Roughly 2,400 artillery pieces were abandoned on the continent. More than 60,000 vehicles were left to the advancing Wehrmacht, along with the great majority of Britain's anti-tank guns. The men came home. Their weapons did not. What followed was the most dangerous summer in modern British history. Across the Channel, German planning for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of southern England, was already underway, and the panzer divisions that had just steamrolled through the Low Countries and France were the obvious instrument of any such invasion. Britain's answer was the Home Guard, raised within a week of Anthony Eden's radio appeal in May 1940 and swollen almost immediately to 250,000 volunteers, men too old, too young, or in reserved occupations to serve with the regular army. They drilled with broom handles. They built roadblocks from farm carts. And when German tanks did eventually appear on a Kent lane or a Sussex hillside, as the entire country expected them to that autumn, the Home Guard and what remained of the regular army would have almost nothing capable of stopping them. This was not a hypothetical problem to be solved at leisure. It was a live, ticking one. The standard British anti-tank weapon of the period, the Boy's anti-tank rifle, could just about trouble the thin armor of a light tank or armored car at close range, but it was already being outpaced by the armor going into German medium tanks. Anti-tank guns existed, but there were nowhere near enough of them, and most of the stock had just been left in France. The War Office needed something that an ordinary infantryman, or for that matter, an untrained shopkeeper turned Home Guard volunteer, could use to disable a tank at point-blank range, using whatever could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in vast quantity. The challenge was not really about explosive power. Conventional grenades had explosive power. The challenge was contact. A grenade thrown at a moving tank in 1940 would, more often than not, simply bounce off the hull and roll away before detonating, its blast wasted on open air rather than armor plate. What Britain needed was a way of making an explosive charge stay exactly where it landed, for long enough to do its job. That problem, deceptively simple to state, was the one that would eventually justify gluing a bomb to bird lime. The man behind the answer was Major Millis Jefferies, a Royal Engineers officer and explosive specialist who had spent years in India before the war and who, alongside Lieutenant Colonel Joe Holland, ran a small and deliberately obscure department called MIREC, part of the War Office's Military Intelligence Research Branch tasked with devising weapons for irregular and clandestine warfare. Jefferies had been turning over the idea of an adhesive anti-tank charge since at least 1938, drawing in part on the work of two Cambridge scientists, Bauer and Schulman, who had explored related demolition charge concepts. His key recruit was Stuart McCrae, a peacetime magazine editor and gadget enthusiast who became Jefferies's deputy and the grenade's principal engineer. Together, working initially from a cramped basement workshop in the cellars of the London offices of Radio Normandy, and later from a requisitioned country house called The Firs at Whitchurch in Buckinghamshire, conveniently close to Churchill's own country residence at Chequers, the two men ran what would become known, half admiringly and half despairingly, as Churchill's Toy Shop, formally designated MD1. The principle Jefferies settled on was elegant in concept and alarming in execution. Rather than relying on a thrown grenade's momentum to keep it against a hole, why not make the explosive itself stick? The design that emerged, the number 74, Grenade Mark I, consisted of a spherical glass flask roughly 11 centimeters across, holding approximately 0.57 kilograms of semi-liquid nitroglycerin, desensitized with additives to make it marginally less prone to detonating if dropped. That flask was wrapped in a knitted woolen sleeve, and the sleeve was then coated thickly in bird lime, an extraordinarily tenacious natural adhesive traditionally smeared on tree branches to trap small birds by their feet. To protect this sticky payload during transport, the whole assembly was housed inside a two-part sheet metal casing, which in turn attached to a wooden, and later bakelite, handle roughly 13 centimeters long, containing two safety pins, a spring-loaded lever, and a 5-second fuse. The method of use on paper sounds almost domestic. The operator pulled the first pin, and the protective metal casing fell away, exposing the glass sphere and its adhesive coating to the world and to the operator's own trousers in equal measure. A second pin armed the firing mechanism. The recommended technique was not, as instinct might suggest, to lob the thing from a safe distance. Accuracy when thrown was poor, and the chances of the grenade actually adhering on impact were slim. Instead, the user was meant to run directly at the tank, close enough almost to touch it, and smash the grenade against the engine decking or hull with as much force as he could manage, shattering the glass and spreading the nitroglycerin paste directly onto the armor in a thick, sticky disc. Only then would he release the handle, letting the lever fall away to trigger the 5-second fuse, and then run, as fast as humanly possible, in the opposite direction. The resulting explosion, concentrated against a small contact area rather than dispersed in open air, could punch through roughly 25 millimeters of armor plate, comparable to a sledgehammer blow concentrated onto an area not much bigger than a dinner plate, which against the engine decks and weaker upper surfaces of early war light tanks and armored cars was often more than sufficient. It is worth dwelling, briefly, on just how poorly this design sat with Britain's own weapons procurement establishment. The Ordnance Board, the body responsible for formally approving new weapons for Army service, examined the sticky bomb and refused to sanction it. Their objections were not unreasonable. Trials conducted in the summer of 1940 found that the adhesive failed almost completely on any surface that carried even a thin film of dust or dried mud, which is to say, on virtually any tank that had actually been driven anywhere. Major General Hastings Ismay reported to the War Cabinet at the end of June that the bomb had simply failed to stick to tanks coated in the dirt of normal campaigning. There were further concerns, well justified, about a weapon that could just as easily glue itself to the user as to the enemy. What changed the calculation was not engineering, but politics. Winston Churchill, briefed on the weapon and keenly interested in unconventional solutions to Britain's invasion crisis, personally overruled the Ordnance Board. His instruction, recorded in a War Office minute from October 1940, read simply, "Sticky bomb, make 1 million." 2 days later, the Secretary of State for War, Anthony Eden, noted in a cabinet minute that the order would proceed regardless of the trial's disappointing results. It is a rare thing in the history of weapons development to have a prime minister personally force a rejected design into mass production. It happened here. Manufacturing began at the end of 1940, but slowly, frustratingly slowly given the urgency that had supposedly justified bypassing the Ordnance Board in the first place. By December of that year, fewer than 66,000 had actually been produced, against a weekly output of only 5 to 10,000, far short of what Churchill's million-unit order implied. There was even a proposal, given the gap between ambition and output, to scale the original order back to 200,000. Engineers at MD1 made incremental improvements as production continued, most significantly replacing the fragile glass flask with a more robust plastic casing in what became the No. 74 Mark II, finally winning grudging acceptance from the Ordnance Board once testing showed the revised version performing more consistently. Production, once it found its rhythm, was substantial. Across the full run from 1940 to 1943, approximately 2.5 million sticky bombs were manufactured, the great majority going to Home Guard units who, by most contemporary accounts, took to the strange weapon with considerably more enthusiasm than the regular Army's own ordnance experts ever managed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operationally, the sticky bomb led a curious double life. Within Britain itself, it became almost a Home Guard signature weapon, despite the regular Army never fully embracing it, training thousands of volunteers in church halls and on village greens to run at a stationary practice tank, slap the bomb against its flank, and dive for cover. The training was not without cost. One frequently retold account from a Home Guardsman named Bill Miles describes a comrade who got his sticky bomb stuck fast to his own trouser leg during practice and could not shift it. A quick-thinking colleague reportedly whipped the man's trousers off entirely and threw them clear, the subsequent explosion leaving them, in his words, in rather more of a mess than they already were. Stories like this circulated widely enough that they have become something close to folklore, though precise casualty figures from training accidents are not fully documented, and you should treat the wilder anecdotes with appropriate caution. The weapon's most clearly documented combat use came not on British soil at all, since the expected German invasion never arrived, but on the other side of the Mediterranean. In North Africa, despite the regular Army never being formally issued the weapon, sticky bombs found their way to British and Commonwealth units fighting in Tunisia, and during the German offensive towards Thala in February 1943, the closing weeks of the Tunisian campaign, they were credited with disabling some 6 German tanks. They were also issued in smaller numbers to the 1st Special Service Force at the Anzio beachhead in Italy in 1944, 2 Australian forces fighting the grueling jungle campaigns at Wau and Milne Bay in New Guinea, and to French resistance cells, for whom a weapon that could be carried compactly and used without specialist training had obvious appeal for sabotage operations against German armor and transport. Records from resistance operations are, by their nature, sparse and fragmentary, and exact figures for sticky bombs used in clandestine actions across occupied Europe simply do not survive in any reliable form. What can be said with confidence is that the weapon traveled far further and saw far more varied use than its troubled domestic trials in 1940 might have suggested. It is worth setting the sticky bomb against what other nations were doing to solve the identical problem, because the comparison is genuinely instructive. Germany, facing its own infantry anti-tank gap later in the war as Allied armor improved, developed the Haftladung, a magnetic hollow-charge demolition device that German infantry would clamp directly onto a tank's hull using 3 integrated magnets rather than adhesive. It was, in most technical respects, a more sophisticated weapon than the sticky bomb. Its shaped charge warhead could punch through considerably more armor than the No. 74's roughly 25 millimeters, and a magnet does not care whether a tank is covered in mud, which was precisely the weakness that had so troubled the sticky bomb's British testers. But the German solution was not without its own irony. By late 1943, German engineers had begun coating their own tanks in a textured paste called Zimmerit, specifically to prevent magnetic charges from gripping the hull, an unintended complement to the basic concept that the British and Germans had separately arrived at, and a tacit admission that contact-fused, hand-placed anti-tank weapons remained a serious enough threat to justify an entire production line countermeasure. The Americans, for their part, leaned away from adhesive or magnetic contact charges altogether and instead poured resources into the bazooka, a rocket-propelled, shaped-charge weapon that let the operator engage a tank from a genuinely useful distance, sidestepping the entire run-up and glue-it-on problem that defined the British approach. Judged purely as engineering, the sticky bomb was probably the least elegant of these 3 solutions. Judged as a stopgap that could be designed, approved under direct prime ministerial pressure, and put into mass production within months during Britain's most exposed summer of the war, it did precisely the job that had been asked of it, however gracelessly. Assessing the sticky bomb's actual historical impact requires a certain honesty about the limits of the evidence. Its psychological value to a home guard that had almost nothing else to carry against an expected panzer assault is difficult to overstate, even if that value never had to be tested against a real German invasion of England, an invasion that, as history records, never came. Its material impact in the campaigns where it did see action, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and occupied Europe, was real but modest, measured in single-digit tank kills at engagements like Thala, rather than any kind of decisive battlefield contribution. Historians remain divided on how much weight to give a weapon whose most dramatic documented successes amount to half a dozen tanks at one Tunisian crossroads, set against thousands of units issued and an uncertain, probably significant number of training injuries among the home guardsmen who handled it. What is not in dispute is the design lineage it helped establish. The contact-fused, focused charge principle that Jeffress pioneered with the sticky bomb fed directly into MD1's later work, including the limpet mine used against enemy shipping and, eventually, more refined hollow-charge demolition devices that abandoned adhesive altogether in favor of magnets or simple manual placement, technology that would echo forward into the broader development of shaped-charge anti-armor weapons through the rest of the century. Surviving examples of the No. 74 can today be seen in several British military museums, including collections connected to the Home Guard's wartime history, generally displayed safely deactivated behind glass, which is, all things considered, the only sensible way to display a weapon largely made of unstable explosive and bird glue. So return, for a moment, to that dusty road outside Thala in February 1943. A soldier crouched in a slit trench, holding a weapon that the men who designed it knew was flawed, that the men who approved it knew failed its own trials, and that the Prime Minister who forced it into existence overruled his own experts to obtain. Everything about the sticky bomb, on paper, argued against it working at all. The adhesive failed on mud. The glass shattered in transit. It could glue itself to a soldier's leg as readily as to a tank's hull, and on more than one training ground it very nearly did. And yet here it was, in the hands of ordinary infantrymen fighting in the desert, doing exactly what Millis Jeffress had drawn up on a sketch pad 5 years earlier, sticking an explosive charge to armor plate for just long enough to blow a hole through it. That is the real story of the sticky bomb and of Churchill's toy shop more broadly. Britain in 1940 did not have the luxury of building the perfect weapon. It had the luxury, if you can call it that, of desperation, and desperation produced an extraordinary, occasionally absurd, occasionally lethal to its own side piece of engineering that nonetheless punched through tank armor on 3 continents over the better part of 3 years. 2.5 million were built. Perhaps a few dozen tanks were confirmed destroyed, a number almost embarrassingly small set against that production run, and yet entirely beside the point, because the sticky bomb was never really about statistics. It was about giving a frightened, underarmed nation something, anything, to put in its soldiers' hands when the alternative was nothing at all. Bird glue and nitroglycerin should not have won a war. For a few desperate months and on a handful of distant battlefields afterwards, it didn't have to win one. It just had to work often enough for long enough. Against every reasonable expectation, it did.